Again, good morning, everyone. My name is Warren Cohen, and I'm the head of the government segment here at LexisNexis. I'm pleased to be facilitating today's Rule of Law Cafe. So as LexisNexis, we have a long and proud history of supporting the rule of law on a global basis, and we believe it is the very foundation for the development of peaceful, equitable, and prosperous societies. So today in specific, we'll be looking at the issue of prosecuting crimes against humanity. We are delighted to partner with the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa today as we explore some of the intricacies involved in trying to ensure that the wheels of justice continue to turn when it comes to investigating and prosecuting past crimes. We are very pleased and also quite privileged today to have two experts with us to help us navigate this complex conversation. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Yasmin Sooka. Yasmin is the chairperson of the Supervisory Board for the Foundation for Human Rights. Yasmin has served on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, playing an integral role in the early discussions around the framing of the TRC. Today, Yasmin continues fighting for criminal accountability for serious international crimes globally in her capacities of a chairperson of the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan and the executive director of the International Truth and Justice Project, documenting gross human rights violations in Sri Lanka. Welcome, Yasmin. It's truly an honor to have you with us today. And we really look forward to the discussions. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning to all of the participants in the Rule of Law Cafe. It's quite a privilege to be here, and thank you to LexisNexis for doing this.
It's our privilege too. Thank you, Yasmin. Our second expert and panelist, which we are also very privileged and honored to have with us today, is Howard Varney. He's the lead counsel on the TRC cases. Howard Varney is a practicing advocate at the Johannesburg Bar and a legal representative acting for several families of victims of apartheid-era crimes. His legal practice comprises human rights, constitutional and administrative law cases. Howard also serves as a senior program advisor at the International Center for Transitional Justice. His areas of expertise include investigations, prosecutions, institutional reform, and reparations. So Howard, welcome. Really, it's a privilege to have you with us as well and to be part of this webinar today. I think you're on mute.
Apologies. Thanks so much, Warren, for the introduction and also for the invite to be with the LexisNexis Rule of Law Cafe. I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion.
Thank you. Thank you again to both of you for making time. I know how busy you are. Just this kind of work, it's a lifetime commitment and dedication. So thank you for taking time out today. We will try our utmost best to stick to time. I'll be very sensitive to that. So Yasmin, I'd like to start with you. If we can just jump straight into it. Not everybody knows you. I must be honest, Yasmin, up until the time of this webinar, I had to go and do a little bit of research on both you and Howard, and it was just amazing to see what you've done. So my first question to you really is, could you share with us just a little about how you got into the work of the law, justice and human rights, and what personally drives your dedication to these areas?
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, I grew up in a family of activists in South Africa. And of course, if you were Black, it was really unusual if you didn't support the struggle against apartheid. And of course, in that context, very early on in my life, I knew that I wanted to study law. But, you know, it was really working under a number of very critical people in my life. My father, who spent most of his life setting up non-racial sports in South Africa at schools, participating in anti-apartheid organizations. And then, of course, as a student, I served at the Legal Aid Bureau in Johannesburg, an advice office that really dealt with the most poor in Johannesburg under two really remarkable women, the late Pauline Lipson and Dolly Goldblatt. And then I was also part of the interfaith movement, together with the World Council of Churches, the South African Council of Churches, and the World Conference on Religion and Peace, and worked under the late Sheena Duncan. And I'm sure most South Africans would know this really formidable lady. But we were part of the discussions around the transition in South Africa. And in that context, I was part of a committee that brought exiles home to participate in the negotiations at the time. So I guess my interest in law and human rights was also formed by the fact that the firm I was working for represented a number of people who had run into trouble with the South African government around the question of their struggle against apartheid. What inspires me? Guess every day it's a privilege to get up and to be able to see what we can do to ensure that survivors regain agency, but also are able to regain the truth and justice for what happened to them and loved ones during the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasmin. I'm sitting here with a bit of a smile on my face because I didn't expect to hear so much of what you've been involved in, just that got you started in this work. And I think you mentioned earlier on that you're a human rights lawyer, and I can only imagine that that's the only way to put it is that it's going to cost you your life to get involved in this. You know, there's no gray area. It's all or nothing, you know, and thank you for sharing that. As the chairperson of the Supervisory Board of the Foundation for Human Rights, could you tell us just a little bit about the work, the Foundation for Human Rights and its mandate?
The Foundation for Human Rights is also a transitional justice baby, if I can call it that. You know, in the 1996 period, the European Union and the government of President Mandela agreed that they needed to set up this joint human rights structure, which would really look at addressing the legacy of the past, but it would also build constitutional democracy and build a human rights culture in South Africa. And it would do that by you know, developing strategic programs to address these goals, and also support the work of civil society in our country through providing them with grants to enable them to do their work. And so in the first 10 years, much of the work that you saw around the Constitutional Court, the Human Rights Commission and the Gender Commission, this was supported by the foundation. And in fact, you know, one of the first cases to go to the courts, the Grootboom case, was one that was funded by the foundation. And of course, there were many others that followed. But the Commission also supported the work of advice officers and paralegals in our country, and the question of the struggle for equality, non-racialism, and of course, justice around the question of reparations for the rights of victims of political violence. And so these were programs that even today form the backdrop of the work that the foundation does, working across the length and breadth of our country in the most rural areas to support people.
Thanks, Yasmin. I did take some time out to go onto the website for the Foundation for Human Rights. There's just so much work that we are not aware of that the foundation is doing. So I really salute you and the team for what you are doing there at the FHR. It's quite amazing. And I think the only downfall probably is that we don't get to hear about it much. Unless you're working in that space, you will hear about the programs being run by the foundation. But most of civil society, and we don't know much about what the foundation does. So it's a privilege for me to be part of today's session, purely because I'm getting schooled in really the hard work and the dedication of the individuals involved. Earlier on, we alluded to the fact that you were part of the initial stages in the TRC, and you served on the TRC and played an integral role in the early discussions around framing the TRC. Can you share a bit more about that for us and the attendees today?
Thank you. You know, in terms of, you know, really well-established international law, there's a duty on a state that comes into power to deal with the abuses of the past state. And of course, in that context, the state has to ensure that victims' rights are preserved, particularly the right to truth, the right to justice, the right to reparations, and what we call the never, never again principle, the right to non-repetition. Of course, in the context of South Africa, we had a negotiated settlement, and there was no real winner in the case of our conflict. And so while many of us had expected that the first thing that would happen is the prosecution of the officials and the apartheid government, this was, of course, one of the issues that was negotiated at the interim stage of the negotiations. And of course, one of the last settlements, you know, the generals wanted to have a blanket amnesty, and they were putting a lot of pressure on President de Klerk to secure that. And of course, on the other side, people wanted to see criminal prosecutions. But in the end, the compromise was that there would be a conditional amnesty. And the amnesty would be premised on two principles. The first is that there would be voluntary disclosure and individual application. And the second was that, you know, you would have to prove actually that you had done these crimes in the pursuit of the objectives of either the former state and its agencies or the liberation movements. And if you did that and the amnesty conditions were satisfied, then of course you would not be prosecuted. And if you were in prison, you would be released. Now, this of course was a huge blow to the human rights community in South Africa, because we believe that actually what the liberation movements had done had negotiated away the rights of victims. And so we were confronted with this question around whether we participate in the process or whether in fact we boycott it and take it to court. And the first Minister of Justice appointed by the late President Mandela, the late Dala Oma, of course said to us, you know, you can be activists in the cause of the rights of victims, and you can come into this process and you can ensure that the rights of victims are secured. And so, of course, in that context, the late George Bezos and a number of us participated in the process with the committee that had been set up to deal with these questions. And we believe that, in fact, we had secured the rights of victims to ensure that they would be able to access truth recovery about their own cases around loved ones. Secondly, that they would be able to oppose the amnesty process, and that if they did not have lawyers, we would appoint lawyers for them. But of course, the major issue in terms of the law was that if you did not apply for amnesty, or if you were refused amnesty, then the law would follow its course. And of course, that element is what we are dealing with today. But, you know, in many ways, South Africa led the world, because what it was premising its transition on was the notion of a restorative justice model, which was also based firstly on the constitutional agreements and the commitments to the principles during the first negotiations, and then, of course, moving to a constitutional democracy in which the rights of victims were enshrined. And so when you look at the preamble to the Constitution, this is based on the post-amble to the interim negotiations, which talks about the fact that we come from a very bitterly divided past, but one in which we're going to overcome these differences. And of course, this model is premised on the restoration of the rule of law.
Thank
But
you,
we
Yasmin.
need another seminar to talk about, you know, some of the complexities of this field of transitional justice, actually.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for just to bring us into that world and help us to better understand that it is a complex framework. It's not as simple as we from the outside would maybe just look at it and make assumptions, because we're not involved intricately. So thank you for sharing that. I have a couple more questions for you, but I feel based on what you've shared, I have a question for Howard that I would like to just bring Howard in at this stage. Howard, you're a practicing advocate at the Johannesburg Bar. You're also a legal representative, as I've introduced earlier, acting for several families of victims of apartheid era crimes. We're now nearly 30 years into our democracy in South Africa. Have we failed? Or I'm not sure if we have, but how have we failed is maybe how I should phrase the question. Just as someone that's not that involved, have we failed? How have we failed in terms of building accountability and ensuring that justice is served for past crimes against humanity in South Africa? If you could give us some input into that.
Thanks for that question, Warren. And just building on the background and context that Yasmin has given, in my view, we have failed victims and families of apartheid era crimes. As Yasmin mentioned, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in the 1990s, that was a groundbreaking experience for South Africa. And as Yasmin mentioned, it's become something of the gold standard for countries emerging from repression and conflict. And of course, we're very proud of the work that happened. The aftermath of the TRC that has proven to be really disappointing. Now, as Yasmin set up, there were meant to be consequences for what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She mentioned the fact that those who didn't apply for amnesty or who were denied amnesty had to face certain consequences, namely investigation and prosecution. And by and large, that has not happened. I'd also add that there were other obligations arising from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. The question of reparations. Only a small number of victims have received reparations, and they say those reparations have been quite inadequate. Several thousand victims, for various reasons, were unable to make a statement to the Reconciliation Commission. They've been forever excluded from the reparations process. The government has adopted what they call a closed-list policy. In one fell swoop, they have stopped the registration of victims post the TRC and simply refused to open their doors to provide support to, we believe, as many as 100,000 victims of gross human rights violations from the apartheid era. On the question of justice, which we're focusing on this morning, not only has there been a lackluster approach, but I'm sorry to say that in recent years, through investigations, we've discovered that there was something of an unholy conspiracy to suppress the cases recommended by the Commission for further investigation. After the Amnesty Committee wound up its process in early 2000, around 300 to 400 cases were handed over to the NPA for further investigation and possible prosecution. And as we speak today, less than a handful of those cases have gone ahead. And one has to ask, well, why have so few cases gone ahead? I think the answer, much of the answer, can be traced to this conspiracy, because that's the only word I can think of to describe it accurately, simply close down those cases. And this happened as early as 2003 with the creation of a structure within government to find ways of promoting impunity. There's much I can tell you about what they did. Perhaps I'll pause there, because that's the biggest challenge we're facing: overcome the structural suppression of these cases.
Thanks, Howard. I promise you I was slightly hesitant to ask this question, making an assumption that we have failed. but I think you've really clarified that in principle we did, and there's still so much work to be done. And it sounds like we've barely scraped the surface. If you're talking about so many cases that's just being sidelined and not being handled, and people are just not getting justice. So I'd like to keep you both on the line for now, if that's fine, because this takes me to my next question to Yasmin, which you may be able to give some input into as well, Howard. I know that the Foundation for Human Rights has a flagship program called The Unfinished Business of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And much of what is being said speaks to the fact that this program needed to come into play because there is unfinished business. So Yasmin, if you could share with us just a bit more on what the program is about, and what the program sets out to achieve.
Thank you. I mean, the program is really premised on the notion that victims have a right under international law and domestic law through the right to the truth, the right to criminal justice, the right to reparations, and of course, what we call the guarantee of non-recurrence or institutional reform. And so, of course, in that context, even when the foundation began its work, one of the programs it supported was the work of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It provided grants to organizations who were working with victims, and it also supported the writing of the final report of the Truth Commission. And so when I arrived at the foundation in 2001, this is when the Truth Commission was drafting its final report to the South African government, and in that context also assisted me to do a lot of work. Now, Howard spoke about, you know, the between 300 and 400 cases which the Commission handed over to the National Prosecutorial Authority and the Department of Justice. And this was done on the basis that in those cases, the Commission had not been able to continue its investigations and it needed more work. It also included cases where amnesties had been refused and were still in the process of discussion. And of course, it included cases where nobody had applied for amnesty. Now, remember, in the Truth Commission, you had 3 committees: the Human Rights Violations Committee, which was really dealing with victims. It was conducting investigations and most of the hearings that you saw across the country. And then, of course, you had a separate stream for the amnesty applicants, and that committee was headed by judges and legal practitioners. And in fact, they had to look at whether amnesty applicants met these conditions of full disclosure and also proving, in fact, that the crimes they had perpetrated had been in pursuit of the aims and objectives of either the former state or the liberation movements. And of course, in those instances where they had not, then of course the law had to follow its course. And of course, you had the 3rd committee, the Reparations Committee, that really developed, in my view, one of the most comprehensive, holistic programs on reparations, which in fact the government of South Africa, the democratic government, mind you, did not actually implement properly. And in fact, that is why we sit with some of these issues today. And so the unfinished business for the Foundation for Human Rights is really about dealing with these 3 issues: how to support the families of victims to continue to, you know, see their rights implemented. And of course, in the main, this is meant dealing with truth recovery and the right to justice through criminal prosecutions, and of course, the holding of inquests in South Africa, finding pro bono attorneys who would take up these cases, and then, of course, all of the counsels who work under Howard's lead, and in fact, who actually are, you know, protecting the rights of victims in the courts. And then, of course, there's the question of reparations, and the other is, of course, the question of access to the TRC archives and the archives that may have an implication for victims. Now, in this context, this program has been running for more than 26 years, and of course has had to support litigation against the state, firstly, for access to prosecution guidelines. Secondly, to stop the president using his pardons discretion to give people who had been denied amnesty or were not applied another bite at the amnesty cherry. And thirdly, to support victims through, inquest to recover the truth about what happened to loved ones. And then, of course, these prosecutions. And of course, we can spend a lot more time talking about that. But right now, there are about 36 cases that the foundation has taken on. And I think about 10 of them are active at this moment, either going through the legal system in terms of inquests. And of course, we have at least 3 cases where, the state is supposed to be prosecuting, but where they've really delayed the cases. And of course, as Howard spoke about, this question of time, lots of perpetrators are dying. And then, of course, also families of victims are very old. Many of the relatives have passed on. And so in this ensuing chaos, what we are trying to ensure is that you keep alive the rights of victims. But it's a very difficult process if the state doesn't do what it has to do. And in that context, I would say that the South African government has failed in its obligations.
Thanks, Yasmin. I just want to ask Howard a question, if I may, because a lot's coming through about the families that still hasn't received that support and justice. What are some of the key challenges, Howard, faced by the families and their legal representatives in ensuring that justice is served? I mean, there is a specific time frame in which cases are allowed to be taken forward. But in all of that time, families are sitting and waiting and wondering, and as Yasmin mentioned, have moved passed away, so I just wonder if you can maybe share with us what are some of the key challenges that you've been faced up with and your team.
Yes, sure, Warren. The challenges are pretty huge for the families. Certainly at a legal level, as you correctly point out, most cases, in fact, cannot be resurrected. Family members have passed on, but also perpetrators, suspects, witnesses, that they've also passed on. So I think it's true to say that the vast majority of cases are dead and buried. I don't know the exact figure, but I would say probably between 80 to 90% of cases simply cannot be resurrected at this stage. And that's really unforgivable. It's unforgivable that the post-apartheid state has allowed the state of affairs to materialize. And there is a huge onus on the institutions of state to pursue those remaining cases that can be taken forward. Certainly when it comes to, for example, civil claims, they have all prescribed many years ago. When it comes to criminal prosecutions, of course, all the lesser crimes would have prescribed under the 20-year rule of the Criminal Procedure Act. But as we know, the very serious crimes such as kidnapping and murder, as well as the international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, they never prescribe. So long as families wish to see justice done, and there are perpetrators who are still alive, those cases need to be pursued with enormous vigor. And families have struggled to persuade police and prosecutors since the winding up of the TRC to do their jobs. But certainly from 2000 onwards, that was an uphill struggle for them. They were simply getting little or no joy. Yasmin mentioned that we had to go to court a few times. So, for example, the NPA issued a new prosecution policy, really providing multiple more grounds to refuse to prosecute cases. We had to go to the courts and have that policy struck down. Then the new shenanigan was the political pardons process. There are those who didn't benefit from the amnesty program and another shot at impunity. We ended up in the Constitutional Court on that matter. And again, the court struck it down because victims were excluded. And I should say, Warren, compared to other countries emerging from conflict, we are lucky that we do have in this country some respect for the rule of law, even though, of course, it's still an uphill battle, as you know better than most. But we do have an independent judiciary. We do have an enforceable constitution, and so that challenges for practitioners to make use of these institutions to afford justice. We need to expose why justice was closed down. We need to push for an independent commission of inquiry. We need to persuade our friends and colleagues in the police and the National Prosecuting Authority to really up the ante with these cases. And we've had several discussions with them, and I'm pleased to say that there has been some progress. We did ask for a specialized approach to these cases. The specialist unit within the SAPS, the DPCI, they have set up a unit dealing with the TRC cases. And within the NPA, they've also set up what's called a TRC component. So we are grateful that there has been some movement. But sadly, as Yasmin mentioned, as we sit here today, only 3 cases are before the courts. All 3 cases are delayed. So really more needs to be done. For example, we think actually an investigating directorate required for these cases, where you have prosecutors, investigators, and specialists under one roof, working together to these cases, because the window of opportunity is fast closing. We think there's only around 4 or 5 years left to get these cases finalized. If we can't do it within the next few years, then we will have failed South Africans. We will have failed the victims and their families. And dare I say, we will have demeaned the historic compromises made in the mid-1990s, which really would be a terrible thing to happen.
Thanks, Howard. Can I just ask a follow-on question? Because you said you made a comment that we've only got about 5 years left. And my follow-on question really is, how do you deal with cases that fall outside of this period to bring them to justice? And what are some of the particular legal approaches that yourself and your team would have undertaken to address this?
Well, it's a race against time. So, almost every day of the week, we're always exploring opportunities to get cases off the ground. Foundation, for example, has hired a full-time investigator. We're trying to raise more funds to hire more investigators for purposes of finding leads, finding witnesses, handing the information over to the DPCI and the NPA, supporting them. But it is a race against time. Take the Craddock 4 case, a very well-known case to South Africans. We estimate that there are around 49 potential suspects associated with that case. We've discovered that less than 10 of the 49 are still alive. And of those 10, 3 have passed away since last year. So that just gives you a sense that if we don't push these matters, then justice will not be done, and we will have failed the Kalatas and the Genevas and so many others. And also we need to make sure that when these cases are brought, that the crimes that are charged reflect the nature of the violations that took place. Certainly, under apartheid, it wasn't just kidnappings, murder and torture that took place. We believe crimes against humanity were committed because these crimes were not isolated. They were orchestrated, they were part of an organized plan. They were widespread and systematic. And so far, we have encountered some resistance from the authorities in pursuing such crimes. Yes, there are some complications because we only ratified the Rome Statute, the law that implements the International Criminal Court in this country in 2002. But nonetheless, it's well known that under customary international law, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the like, all passed into customary international law. Years ago, post World War II, we saw these crimes being preferred in the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, and in other subsequent international tribunals. We know that international crimes such as torture, murder, and kidnapping as crimes against humanity have passed into customary international law as early as the mid-20th century and thereafter. I'm pleased to say that we have persuaded at least one set of prosecutors here in Johannesburg to indict two accused with crimes against humanity in the COSAS 4 case, which is currently before the High Court in Johannesburg. Sadly, also delayed, but they have been charged with apartheid as a crime against humanity, as well as murder as a crime against humanity. And we're trying to get that case moved forward. In fact, we're in court on the 11th of October to try and deal with the ongoing delays in that matter. I won't go into the details unless you wish me to.
But
Thanks,
maybe
Howard.
maybe just you talked about legal strategies. And of course, I think both of us set out that families also have a right to the truth. And so in those cases where it's not really been possible, to deal with prosecutions initially, we have persuaded the Department of Justice and the Minister to open up inquests. And of course, in those inquests, we've been able to go back and examine the evidence that came before the previous inquest. And so we've had very successful outcomes. And the case of Neil Aggart, where in fact the court found that he had not taken his own life, but that the state was responsible for his killing, I think was really one important advancement for the families, because families suffer when they think that loved ones were so desperate that they took their own lives. And of course, the case of Ahmed Timor, who also was said to have jumped from the 10th floor. And the court actually found that that didn't happen. And in fact, there was an indictment in that case, but the perpetrator died before he could go to trial. So these are very important mechanisms for truth recovery in our country. But at the same time, they also need to happen fairly quickly so that those of the perpetrators and witnesses who are still alive can actually testify. And of course, we have one that is coming up in the Western Cape, the death of the late Imam Harun, who was said to have slipped and fallen off stairs. The state has agreed to reopen the inquest, and Howard will be leading the family's testimony in that case. And these reviews of what happened in the past are really important to come to terms with how organized the state was. And I think that's important, the systematic nature and the fact that these were policy decisions to take the lives of people who opposed the state.
Yasmin, just another question for you. You've in fact dedicated in South Africa your life to what you call the structural questions at the heart of transition, and the questions and issues that have been glossed over only to be magnified today. Could you unpack that just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, it's really important that we understand that in fact you don't have individuals who make decisions around taking out the lives of others, but that really this is a structural system within the state that starts at the very top. And you have people at the top, probably the politicians and those who are in charge of government, who in fact, I think after 1980 decided that, using matters going through the courts were not really a suitable way to deal with the deaths of people. And so they set up death squads in South Africa to take people out. Now, one of the questions I think we have to ask is whether we have ever dismantled the machinery completely that exists in the state. And because we haven't dealt with the impunity that it's existed both at the level of the state and its institutions, including the police, including the NPA, there are people who are sitting across the board who have simply continued to do their business, but in another way. And while we're talking today about what I would call civil and political violations, there's another nexus as well. And that is really the corruption that was endemic during the apartheid state. And in fact, when you look at much of what we see today in terms of state capture and corruption, many of those same entities have continued to proliferate and be responsible almost for this nexus to corruption. The only thing is that because we haven't had institutional reform in our country, you've replaced those former faces with faces belonging to people who came into power during the aftermath of the democratic transition in our country. And so, of course, there are other groups like the Open Secrets and many other organizations across the country who are trying to unpack what happened during that period. But what we've never done is completely dismantled, the intelligence forces, those structures, people in the military, and even in the case of the NPA, there are people who are sitting there who ought not to be working there and who have been implicated either in corruption or in some kind of deal which has prevented the truth from coming to the fore. And that's what our country needs to look at, that if you want to deal with, a South Africa that is truly authentic in terms of its constitution, you really need to think about how you understand the structural nature of these forces that continue to exist in our country. It's not a surprise, therefore, when you look at the levels of murders in our country, you have death squads operating that are taking out political opponents. And in fact, I think recently there was a report that was published by Stellenbosch University, which actually raised the specter of South Africa becoming a criminal state. And so, this raises the question of the recommendations made by the Zondo Commission. And if it goes down the same line that the recommendations that the Truth Commission made, then we're going to have to ask the question, what's the commonality there? And do people not want to see the rule of law in our country? And this really requires citizens' action and also really a concerted effort by legal practitioners to really raise their voices in the cause of supporting the rule of law. It's only if we all tackle this and not see this as a white or a black problem, but really to see this as a problem of the rule of law, we're never going to change our country.
Yasmin, as you were talking and explaining, that the one thing that we haven't done, and I wrote it down so that I don't forget that we haven't actually completely dismantled the intelligence structure. It's the reason why there's still a cycle of corruption in different ways in our country. Needless to say, the Zondo of what happened around state capture. But my heart just started to beat faster that, are we going anywhere slowly here? So I have a question to both of you, and I'd like Howard to answer first. Would you say that there is an appetite for justice and the will to create institutions that will ensure justice is served?
Thanks for that question, Warren. Before answering it, if I can just add to what Yasmin has said between the connection between corruption and our past history. I think there is a strong connection. And if one looks at the political interference into the work of the NPA and the SAPS in relation to the apartheid era cases, I'm actually of the view that opened the door to the state capture we saw under the President Zuma tenure. And the reason I say this is because if we look back, the way that the political interference on the TRC cases unfolded, powerful elements in society were able to impose their will on state institutions such as the NPA and the SAPS, and were able to persuade them to lay down tools in relation to these cases. And we're talking about a massive suspension of the rule of law in relation to several hundred murder cases, practically all murder cases, the most serious cases under law. These cases were abandoned. And once they were able to see, well, we managed to do this in relation to these cases, it's an easy step to engage in the same capture in relation to investigations and prosecutions dealing with corruption. And I really do believe that connection is there. And in fact, we made that point to the Zondo Commission. We submitted an application together with supporting evidence, asking them to investigate that connection. And sadly, because of their heavy workload, they were unable to get there. We have asked President Ramaphosa, the former TRC commissioners, as well as the families, have asked the president on at least 4 occasions to deal with this issue. So far, we haven't yet been able to persuade them to set up an independent commission of inquiry, but we are keeping up the pressure, and if needs be, we may even approach, compel the setting up of an independent. Warren, sorry, in my
Don't worry, wherever you went with that response, you took us there.
Okay.
We need days and weeks and months.
Question?
The question is there really an appetite for justice and the will to create institutions that will ensure justice is actually served?
Well, there is some appetite, but in my humble and respectful view, it isn't sufficient. So as I mentioned, we've been pushing hard over the last 20-odd years to get these cases off the ground with very limited success, unfortunately. Just in the last 2 to 3 years, since Yasmin Sooka became NDPP, we've had more success, and Yasmin has in fact responded to some of our requests. As mentioned, that they have set up the security component. I believe there are around 25 dedicated prosecutors around the country now working on these cases. So we are grateful to Advocate Batoy and her team, but we really believe that more needs to be done. And unfortunately, in the last 2 years or so, we haven't seen much progress. As mentioned, we're only aware of 3 cases before the courts at the moment. There needs to be more. And in my view, if we are serious about wrapping up these cases in the next 4 to 5 years, we still need a fundamental change in approach. We need a truly dedicated, specialized approach where you bring prosecutors, investigators, and specialists together under one roof And I really think that there's no alternative to an investigating directorate, like we have for corruption, like we have for gender cases and the like, where you have special units under a special director. Without that, I don't believe we're going to be making much progress. So, for example, at the moment, it's entirely unclear to us where to take some of these cases. You know, we're told that following the closing down of the Priority Crime Litigation Unit, previously dealt with these cases, which unfortunately became tainted with the political interference. The cases were farmed out to the DPP offices around the country. Sometimes it's very difficult to find out who's dealing with those cases. And yes, there is now the centralized component falling under the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, Rodney de Kock. But he's a very busy man because he doesn't only deal with these cases. He's the head of the National Prosecution Service. He deals with, you know, he's in charge of the entire prosecution service. And what we need is a special unit or investigating directorate where the buck stops, and it can't be palmed off to different people around the country. And so again, you know, we think there should be some mobilization to persuade the authorities, set up an investigating directorate, a special director at whose desk the buck stops. And until we get that, I think we're going to be.
Thanks, Howard. I'm cognizant of time, and I'm going to ask all of our guests, I mean the attendees, if we could maybe just take an extra 5 minutes if we do tend to run over time. But I would like Yasmin to just wrap it up by also giving your input with the last question, if there's really an appetite for justice. And if you can just wrap it up with that, Yasmin.
Thank you for that question. You know, if you had asked many of the families of victims and victims themselves 26 years ago, you know, what the desire was, many of them were very conflicted. And in fact, all of them obviously asked for prosecutions. But then after the negotiations, you know, together with the religious community, we had workshops across the country with communities and families. And I was quite shocked when we spoke to them, because many of them said, if President Mandela is prepared to reach out and to forgive people after having spent 27 years in jail himself, then of course we are happy to follow that lead. And so of course in that first moment when the commission began its work, many victims indicated that they would be happy with getting access to the truth. But of course, when people come forward or they don't come forward, and when they do come forward and they don't tell the truth, then of course, for many families, that hardens their attitudes. And I would argue that that failure of non-disclosure, coupled with the fact that the democratic state did not implement the recommendations of the commission, which included the investigation and prosecution of these several hundred cases, that has really hardened the attitudes amongst the families of victims. And so the appetite now is incredibly strong for justice. And of course, there are many groups in civil society who support them as well. I would say that with the appointment of someone like Shamila Batoyi, you do see in the NPA that there are many prosecutors who do believe that the struggle for justice is important and their role as well. But these are institutions which are riddled with people who have themselves been compromised. And that is why I think we are asking for a specialized directorate to ensure that these cases receive the time and attention and dedication they need, working with, of course, investigators. Because all of the investigative work, I must say, in any case that is either at the inquest level or at the level of an indictment, has come because of the work of the private investigators that the foundation has supported. First, the late Frank Dutton, and then, of course, the current Brigadier Cliffy Marion, And without their work around these cases, it is hardly likely that you would see them in court. But I think there's another important reason why people should have an appetite for justice. It's also about understanding where South Africa came from. Can you imagine 20 years from now, if we do not see an outcome on these cases, you will have people deny that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And of course, one of the battles that we had during the time of the late President de Klerk was to get him to admit that in fact, apartheid had been declared a crime against humanity by the United Nations and the international community, and that South Africa had also become a criminal state under which death squads had been set out in terms of a policy to take out political opponents of the state, most of whom were civilians and not actually combatants. And in fact, many people will only see the narrative around the criminalization of the state around economic crimes. But in fact, as I pointed out earlier, this corruption and criminalization took place both under the colonial period, followed through during the apartheid period. And of course, unless we understand that nexus, we will never be able to dismantle the institutional structures that have made this possible. And all of the good people we put inside will in fact become destroyed. And in fact, we've seen that with both whistleblowers and really good prosecutors, people like Hermione Cronje, who kind of left the NPA because they didn't feel that the value system they have has been shared and that the work method has been shared. So these are really important solidarity issues for all South Africans to understand, because we want young people to know what the narrative of colonialism and the apartheid state was all about, and not just to be left with the idea that state capture is about Black people. It's not. It has its history and fundamentals that go right back to the period of colonialism and which were really cemented during this period of apartheid. And in supporting victims of the struggle for justice, we also support the struggle for democracy in our country and the struggle for the rule of law. And that's what we all have to see as conjoining all of us and bringing us together.
Thank you, Yasmin. We've run out of time. Thank you to both yourself and to Howard for the wonderful insights. Thank you to our attendees. We trust that you found it insightful. Please remember to use the Q&A tab at the bottom if you have a question. We may be able to get to one question at least. We're going to do a on-screen poll for the attendees. It'll be put up for a few short minutes. If you can maybe just respond to that. The question that has come through, which I think we may have time to just answer, is this is from Mary Burton. We had such high hopes that the TRC process would lead us into new ways to deal with our past, that those who failed to seek amnesty or who were refused amnesty would be prosecuted, that reparations would help in some measure for so much suffering, and that measures would be taken to address ongoing economic and social justice. Yet these hopes have been disappointed. The persistence of FHR, the Foundation for Human Rights, and the legal teams have borne fruit in particular cases and exposed more of the truth. But what are the long-term prospects for reconciliation? Any one of the two of you could answer that question. We're fine with that.
Go for it, Howard.
Thanks, thanks, Mary, for that important question. And actually, Mary, I suspect that you're certainly more qualified than me to answer that question. All I can say is that the reconciliation project in South Africa, which started in those early 90s, and really was pioneered by our late President Nelson Mandela. That continues. Reconciliation certainly is a long-term project, indeed a generational one. It's a journey that I think South Africa is still engaged with. I do think that the failure of the post-apartheid state to address the issues facing victims, their failure to support victims and to ensure that they can rebuild their lives, that has undermined the reconciliation project, because that has excluded so many people from meaningful existence in the new South Africa. The failure to pursue justice, and not only the failure or neglect, but the closing down of justice, is also deeply hurtful and also undermines the reconciliation project. The message that it sends is that the new South Africa will be controlled by elites, those with access to power. The rule of law can be bent for expedient purposes. So I do think we need to continue with these struggles. We are to ensure that meaningful reconciliation takes place.
I mean, I would add that, of course, one of the critiques of the work of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that it was quite narrowly focused on civil and political rights violations, and that it should have focused on the socio-economic dimension of apartheid, in which millions of South Africans had lost their land by 1913. And of course, with millions of them moved out of urban areas and forced into black spots across the country. And of course, what that created was both unemployment, joblessness, and this was really racially based. And the Commission recognized this critique. And so what it did recommend was that there would be a 1% wealth tax that would really be used for redistribution and for the reparations fund. And sadly, of course, the government didn't take up that recommendation. Now, when you look at some of the questions which plague South Africa today, the fact that I think the figure yesterday, and it's probably conservative, is that 34% of South Africans are unemployed. And then, of course, when you look at the question of poverty and inequality, it's deeply racialized. And of course, South Africa really is on the cusp, I would say, of great uncertainty if we don't begin to address these problems. And one question I would argue is really problematic, and that is that we are beginning to see intergenerational trauma. If you look at many of the families, in fact, it's the third generation now that is clamoring for justice. And many of them have become quite cynical about South Africa and its prospects for transformation. And that is why there's an imperative that justice is important, but so too is the struggle for equality and for economic access in our country. And this is where every South African has to come to the party, particularly the corporations who got away scot-free from being the beneficiaries of apartheid during the apartheid period. I always like to, in the early days, we talked about the beneficiaries of apartheid, but these days we have to talk about the beneficiaries of apartheid and the beneficiaries of the transition. And of course, unless they join common cause to see that other people are admitted to be able to live with dignity, the promise of the Constitution, we, I think, are walking a very dangerous road. And while one doesn't want to be alarmist, I think you just have to look at what happened in KwaZulu-Natal in July last year and to ask the question, what have we as South Africans done to ensure that those who were responsible were put behind bars? And to be very frank, we've not been successful on that grounds. What have we done to ensure that we've addressed the underlying structural cause of the economy and poverty in our country? That remains, I think, a vexed question as well. And maybe it's a question of asking, do we have the right leadership to kind of take us through the next 10 years? And I think that's a question all of us have to answer.
Thank you. And I absolutely wish we could engage a bit further There's a myriad of questions that could have come through today. Thank you to the attendees again for giving us that extra 7 minutes, and for our guests as well. Thank you, Yasmin and Howard, for your insight and so freely sharing it with us and being so transparent. We thank you for that. The webinar recording will be made available within the next few days, so look out for it via email. And really, I don't want to summarize anything. You can't summarize a topic like this really, because it's so open still. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of LexisNexis for just taking the time out to be in this webinar, for all our attendees, as well as for our experts on the call, our panelists. Thank you so much, and we really look forward to engaging with you again. Thank you. Stay safe and keep well.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.